We're talking about forgiveness in these couple of blogs that we're doing, or that I'm doing. But I wanted to ask you, has forgiveness been easy or hard for you? Because it's been a very hard transaction for me every time I've had to do it.
Well, as soon as you say that, I think back to those seminars we did earlier in our relationship, Escape from the Ordinary. And there, the mandatory nature of forgiveness was introduced. And I know that I sort of made a list of those people that I needed to go back and ask forgiveness of, and I began to do it. And I found it the most difficult thing to do.
What was difficult about it for you?
Well, you see, in the system that I had created to negotiate life, I had to be right. And so to actually go back and ask forgiveness was to face the reality that I was imperfect and flawed, and that in actuality I had been wrong. And so for me, there was a humbling process, which probably speaks a lot to the amount of pride that I was carrying. And it was so difficult that I think as I went on from that point of just ticking off the list for those that I needed to forgive and go back and ask forgiveness of, I started to live life very carefully within the rules, the boundaries.
Well, I'm curious about what that need is in you to be right and how that connects with forgiveness.
Well, the need to be right was, as I said, the way that I had sort of set up to negotiate life. My early messages were you could do better, which I took on board as saying, well, there's something missing, not quite there. And the way I handled that was to strive to be as right as could be, not to be wrong. Not to get into places where parts of my character would be called into question.
Well, that sounds like you were pretty hard on yourself. Almost perfectionistic.
Oh, very much drawn towards that end of the scale. And on the Enneagram, I'm a 1, a reformer. There was always that not only wanting to reform others, but needing to keep the reform process up on my own situation as well.
So what was the first time you realised I've been wrong in this relationship and I need to go ask forgiveness?
That's a fascinating question. There were a couple of times. I can remember that we were walking one night and we were coming back towards our house, and I just recognised how mean and cruel I'd been during the period of your recovery from quite a difficult breakdown period in your life. And I had this picture of you just getting up off the ground and starting to recover, and it was, now it's my opportunity to let you know all the times that you've hurt me and you've done the wrong thing by me in my framework. And just, I think it was a God thing. I recognise what a cruel, vicious thing to do. And I recognised that I needed to ask you to forgive me.
And when you did ask that, it brought back the very painful memories of that, and I felt the sadness of that and the disconnection that was between us because of that. And it was a beautiful movement for you to actually not only recognise it but ask my forgiveness for it. Did that change things for you?
Yeah, it did. Forgiveness in my life, I think those earlier ones were almost transactional. That one wasn't. That one was from the heart. And what happened was there was a change, an alteration of my perspective, particularly on our relationship. And I think there was a lessening of the demand on you, or the demand that you come through in the way
that I be perfect.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that I sort of expected you to be, and
Yeah,
I
I
saw
felt that pressure to fit into your system of rightness. Yeah.
So that would be there's a slight alteration, I would think, to the perspective and an opening of the possibilities of, you know, what I was proposing and how I saw things and how I thought things should be. It was up to question.
And thank you for sharing that, because I just brought back a memory. I'd forgotten that one. Because there's been one really big one in our lives that we'll talk about next time. But one of the ones that altered me profoundly was forgiving my father. And I'd been doing counsellor training. It was a kind of a need to find some answers for myself that I went into counsellor training. But I'd been in a group, and two of the men were having a conversation across the top of me, really, about him forgiving his father. And he was getting older, and the other guy said, yeah, you're kind of running out of time. I didn't think anything of it, but as I was going home on the bus that night, the conversation just replayed itself in my mind. And I think it was the Holy Spirit that just brought my father to mind. And all of a sudden, I just felt the pain of regret that I had, that what I was doing to him by shutting him out of my life was far more brutal than anything that he had done to me. And I wasn't actually giving the opportunity for reconciliation. And so I walked in the door and I rang him, and we hadn't spoken for years. And he just picked up the phone like we were talking yesterday. And I said, could we meet and have lunch together tomorrow? And he said yes, so we arranged where to meet. And when he got off the train, we were walking down an alley to go to a restaurant. I couldn't even wait till we got there, and I just asked his forgiveness for shutting him out of my life. And he just cried. He broke down and cried like a baby. And, you know, he spent the next hour just pouring out his heart and his own pain and the pain of living with my mother. And even though it was all for him, really, and he really didn't inquire much about me, there was like this huge weight that lifted off my shoulders. And that came into our relationship as well, because, you know, I had put all men in the same category as my father.
What category?
Not to be trusted, will never be there for you, distant, cold, non-protective. So I had cast every man in the same light, you included. And so I was able to soften towards you as well, and look at you for you rather than being in the image of my father. And that was really freeing for me.
I actually felt the freedom of that, and I just love the lightness that it introduced into your life. I can remember it very clearly. I just that movement to just disconnect and not have any connection or contact with him. That's a very strong movement, and I'm just wondering about that, where that comes from.
All my interactions with my parents, and especially my mother, were very bruising, and they would rip open the wounds that were there. And it's almost like I had to close that door to be able to heal myself. It was too difficult to do in their presence. And not only that, I was angry, and you know, my mother was a very bitter woman, and yet I was becoming just like her by shutting them out and becoming bitter about what had been done to me.
So is the movement there, the shutting out, is it an offensive or defensive movement?
Both, I would say.
Explain.
Defensive in that, okay, I'm going to close that door so that I can deal with the pain of my wounds, but offensive in that I'm going to punish you for what you've done to me. So it was both. And they felt the punishment.
Does it give you any insight into, say, perhaps your mother?
No, because my mother never asked forgiveness for anything. She was right all the time.
I understand that.
She was the only one that was right, and she was the only one that was ever allowed to have any emotions in our family. And they just dominated the whole family. So there wasn't room for mine. And I had to diminish parts of myself to actually live in that home. And part of my healing was to reclaim those parts of myself that I had dismissed and got rid of to be acceptable.
I just want to pursue it a little bit. I can recall another time when I asked your forgiveness and I said that I kept a pocket of resentment and just a little one down there just in case I needed it to attack. And I can remember telling that to someone and they said, oh, you kept it for protection. And I'm wondering what part protection plays in
hanging on to that.
Well, to cut off connection with your father and no communication and no connection.
That's a good call because it was protection. It was emotional protection because while the wound was getting ripped open continually, I actually couldn't concentrate on healing the wounds because I'm stuck in that high emotional arousal, if you like, hypervigilance the whole time rather than putting my energy into healing. If I had to do it again, maybe I'd have had better boundaries, and that's another whole topic where I could sort of say no, but I didn't have the sense of self at that particular point in my life to put good boundaries in. And my mother would just override them continually. So yes, it was a protection.
And I think a legitimacy about it, survival.
Yes,
and
very much survival.
Has to be respected. I'm just wondering what forgiving your father did to the protective wall around you, because in a sense it was global.
Yeah. Well, as I said, I did soften towards you and other men, so that was one of the outcomes of it. It made me address forgiving my mother, but I really couldn't do that. That was so hard. That was the hardest one, and it wasn't until she died that I was able to do that process and forgive her. While she was still in my face, I couldn't do it.
Perhaps the protection again. I can remember you did make some attempt while we were in America for a number of years.
That's right, I did too.
And you wrote her a letter. And I know your heart in that letter and the softness of it toward her. But the response... She
poured contempt all over it.
The response was not pleasant.
Which put me into survival mode once again.
Yeah. It seems that can be a pattern with hurt. It's that survival mode clicks into place.
Yes, it's so familiar to me. These days, the time between the hurt and the forgiveness hopefully is a lot less, and I'm a lot more aware of what's going on inside and allowing my emotions to surface rather than shutting them down and shutting them off.
I love that process in you. I mean, even when we're doing a presentation, if you feel that you've crossed a line with someone in communication, I'll notice that you'll sidle up to them after it, and I know that you're asking forgiveness, and that's asking forgiveness, but it's in that area of forgiving and being forgiven, which I think you're learning to live in quite comfortably.
The biggest one was actually when we forgave each other for the hurts of the past, and we'll talk about that next time, because that was very profound, that one.
It was.
So can we leave it there?
We can.